Hi, everybody. I'm Danny Wasner here in JFNA's Jerusalem offices, and I'm just going to take a few minutes today to give a brief explanation of how Israeli elections work, because I know that can be very confusing to many people, especially our audiences in North America, and this is a very important thing to keep in mind before we begin, the American system and the Israeli system are clearly very, very different. And when looking at what happens in elections in Israel, it's very important to keep in mind that this is not the system that we have in America. America is what we know as a presidential system, and Israel is governed and elections work through a parliamentary system. They both may be Western democracies, but they're very different. So the Israeli parliamentary system is much more similar to, for example, what they have in the United Kingdom. So how does the system work? So first of all, I think the most important distinction to keep in mind is that unlike in the United States, Israel does not directly elect a particular person or government or ministers. In America, the president is elected directly by the people. But in Israel, the people of Israel only elect one thing, and that is the Knesset, Israel's parliament, which has 120 members. So the Israeli people elect the parliament, elect the Knesset, and then the Knesset in turn will choose from among its own members a prime minister who will form a government, appoint ministers, etc. So the Israeli people only elect the Knesset. So how does that work? Well, first of all, the elections are called not like in America on the exact same date every 4 years, the first Tuesday in November, whatever it is. In Israel, the term of the government is a maximum of 4 years. But the government can quite easily, and typically does, fall before those 4 years are up because there's no majority in the Knesset for the government. So we don't know when elections will be, but once the government falls, we usually have a period of around 100 to 120 days until the actual elections take place. Now, critically, the most important thing in this lead-up period actually happens up to 45 days before the elections. At that point, 45 days before the elections, every political party in Israel has to have submitted their candidacy for the elections. So if you're a political party, you say, I want to stand in these elections. And most importantly, not only do they say, I want to stand, but they have to submit a list of who their candidates are. And now every party can do that their own way. They submit a list ranked in order from 1 up to a maximum of 120, because that's the most seats you could win. And every party chooses it in their own way. So, for example, Likud and Labour, the two, I guess, what you would call legacy parties, they both have internal party primaries where everybody who's a member of that party can vote, and that determines who the list is. Yair Lapid, the current prime minister, and his Yesh Atid party, in his party, Yair Lapid determines the list himself. There are ultra-Orthodox parties where there is a panel of rabbis who choose the list. But 45 days before the elections, we know the parties that are standing and we know who their candidates are because they've all submitted those lists. And there's a third thing that they do, relatively minor, but actually quite important, and that is each party gets to choose what I would call a code. It's made out of either 1, 2, or 3 Hebrew letters. So, for example, the Labour Party in Israel has traditionally chosen the letters Aleph, Mem, Taf, which is the Hebrew word for emet, meaning truth. And every party has their own code of, as I said, 1, 2, or 3 letters. So once we do that, we head into a campaign season and then elections. Now, here's the most important, I think, difference between the American and Israeli system. When an Israeli enters the polling booth on election day, they only have one choice to make. They don't vote for a person. They don't vote on any other questions. There are no special elections or special questions or anything like that. And there are no electoral districts. Every single person in Israel has the same choice. They have to vote for a political party. That's all. They choose a party, not a person, not anything else, a party. So when they go in, they have to choose, they're actually faced, and I'll show you a picture here, with a whole selection of these codes that I mentioned, these little slips of paper, and they choose one. So, for example, here are an example of 2. This was the Labour Party. This was the Bayit HaYehudi, Jewish Home Party. So if you were voting for Bayit HaYehudi, you would pick up this with the 2-letter code that you want, put it in your envelope, and you voted. That's all that Israelis do on election day. They choose one slip representing one party, and they know who the candidates of that party is because the list was previously submitted, and that's how they vote. Now, also during the day, this is not officially part of the system, but for anybody watching the election, it's important to note, the big media organizations in Israel conduct exit polls. And these polls are very, very accurate. They're not the final results, of course, they're just polls, but they're far more accurate, typically, historically, than polls that take place before the election. They have much bigger numbers, and they represent the people who've actually voted because they stand outside polling booths. And it is illegal to share any results from those polls until the booths close. There's strict laws on that in Israel. And at 10 p.m. on election day, which is the time all the polling booths close, at that exact moment, 10 p.m., which by the way corresponds to 3 p.m. on the east coast of the United States, at that exact time, the exit polls are released. And as I said, because they're very accurate, you get an immediate indication of how the election is going to look, what the results are going to look like. So a few seconds before 10 p.m., you actually get a countdown on the TV, 10, 9, 8, and then exit polls, and we see the results. So anybody watching 3 p.m. on election day in New York or on the East Coast, you'll see the exit polls and have a good idea how things went. Then, of course, they start counting the actual votes. So what happens? They literally count up all these slips of paper to see how many votes each party got. And then before they do a final tally, there's something that's very important that happens, and it's worth noting because it's really an important part of the system. We have something in Israel called the electoral threshold. What that means is that any party that received less than 3.25% of the total votes cast, they are disqualified and their votes are thrown away. So a party that got less than 3.25% did not reach the electoral threshold, and they're gone. This is a rule, it's a law that's made to discourage small parties and discourage people from voting for small parties. Once that is done, we have all the other parties left, the sort of medium and larger parties. And out of all those votes, again, the numbers are tallied and they're assigned percentages. It's very simple. If, for example, let's say the Labour Party received 10% of all of those valid votes, minus the ones that were thrown out, if they receive 10% of all the votes cast, then they will receive 10% of the votes of the seats in the Knesset. So if you got 10% of votes cast, you'll get 10% of seats in the Knesset. Now we know Knesset has 120 seats. If you got 10%, you will get 12 seats. And that is the system. We now know who the 120 members of the new Knesset are. Again, all Israelis voted for a party, and based on that, we have the composition of the new Knesset. So it should be quite simple at that point. Whoever has a majority in the Knesset can now form a government, can be the prime minister. That's how it works in the United Kingdom, in Australia. For example, the Conservative Party or the Labour Party got half of the seats in their parliament, or more than half of the seats, they form a government. There's only one problem, and this is the situation. This is the issue that distinguishes the Israeli system, I think, most significantly. The problem is that in the entire history of Israel, since 1948, no party has ever got that majority. No party has ever won 61 seats or more. So nobody can form a government. The only way to do that is to make some sort of coalition between the different parties that have been elected. Now, some groups are kind of naturally go together and others do not. So what will happen, for example, the ultra-Orthodox party may go to Benjamin Netanyahu, the head of the Likud party, and say, listen, with our votes, you can get over the 61. So we're willing to support you to join your coalition if you fulfill a few conditions. It might be, we want additional budgets for yeshivot. We want one of our members of Knesset to be the Minister of Interior. We want a law that guarantees there will be no public transportation on Shabbat, or whatever the issues are. And they can go to Netanyahu. They could also go to Yair Lapid and see if he's willing to offer that or offer more. And somehow through that, somebody will get together a coalition and reach 61 or more seats. And then they can become prime minister, form a government, appoint ministers, and run the country until, of course, somebody pulls out. And that's how a government is formed. And the only problem, of course, that worked quite well until recently, but in the last 3 years, we've seen an inability of many of the parties to actually, or any other party, to be able to form. And this side has been able to, on a few occasions, to get to that 61, which basically triggered new elections. Or alternatively, they got to exactly 61 or 62, and they had such a narrow coalition that shortly afterwards, or after a very short amount of time, maybe only a year, the government fell, triggering new elections. That is unfortunately the cycle we're in at the moment. And especially unfortunately, opinion polls for the upcoming election show that this may be the situation again, that it's going to be difficult for anybody to form a coalition. But in short, that's the system. The people of Israel choose one party, elect the Knesset, and the Knesset elects a government.